Whisperbound. Episode 7. Under the Moonlight. The night lay heavy over the forest path the group had reached through the secret passage beneath the old mill. The passage had proven to be far more than a hidden escape route. The air inside had been stifling, and the walls had been covered in eerie runes and ancient engravings that gave off a pulsing light, reminding them of the mysterious images from the prophecy. With every step, the humming in their heads had grown louder, as though the passage itself wanted to speak to them. Kael had finally reached the end and opened the hidden door to the outside. The moment they felt fresh air and pale moonlight again had been a relief. Yet Eve could not shake the feeling that something had remained behind in the shadows of the passage, or had followed them out. Now the group walked silently through the forest, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The only sounds were the occasional crunch of stones beneath their boots and the soft rushing of wind in the trees. Eve kept a little apart while following the others. Pale moonlight broke through the treetops and fell in silver streaks across the ground, but it offered little comfort. Her thoughts wandered to Kael, who had entered her life with that strange silence of his, full of secrets and contradictory signals. Since their first meeting, he had fascinated and frustrated her in equal measure. He was closed off, spoke only what was necessary about himself, and yet there was an intensity in his eyes that she could not ignore. What had driven him to create that refuge? What pushed him forward? And why did he sometimes seem determined to keep everyone in the group at a distance, even in the moments when they needed him most? She remembered the moments when something in him briefly surfaced, a quiet smile, a determined gesture, the hint of something softer behind the hard facade. But those moments were rare and vanished quickly. She wondered whether he had ever truly trusted anyone, or whether he fought his own inner shadows as fiercely as she fought the shadows that followed them through the fog. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound. She looked ahead and saw Mira walking in small steps behind Clara and Finn. The girl looked tired, yet her eyes were wide open, and she seemed to watch every shadow and every movement in the forest with care. Eve felt a stab in her chest. She could hardly imagine what this child had endured, and still Mira seemed to carry a strength inside her that Eve did not fully understand. "Can you not stop brooding?" The voice made her start. Kael had stepped beside her, quiet and sudden, his face only half visible in the moonlight while his eyes searched hers. "Not really," Eve answered softly. "Too many thoughts." He nodded as though he understood. "It does not get easier, you know. The questions never stop, but sometimes they help you find the answers." She studied him, searching his words for a trace of truth, or perhaps for some experience of his own that he simply refused to speak aloud. "Is that the secret? Asking questions until the answers find you?" He shrugged. "Perhaps. Or you stop asking the questions and simply keep going." Eve wanted to answer, but he'd already turned away and walked ahead to the others, who were a little farther up the path. She watched him go and felt something stir inside her. A strange mixture of curiosity, frustration, and an attention she was reluctant to admit even to herself. Kael remained a sealed image whose lines resisted every attempt to interpret them. And still she sensed that he played a decisive role in all of this. The wind moved through the branches above them, and Eve turned her gaze back to the path. Her thoughts kept circling, but she knew she would find no answers that night. Night had long since fallen, and the pale light of the moon shone through the trees, throwing moving shadows across the path before them. The group had settled into a rhythmic silence, each of them sunk in thought. Eve held back a little to create some distance and let her gaze rest on Kael, who walked farther ahead. He moved through the forest with a certainty that was almost unsettling. His shoulders were slightly lowered, yet his stride remained purposeful. He clearly knew exactly where he was leading them, and still he revealed nothing of it. That mixture of certainty and secrecy unsettled Eve and drew her in at the same time. Since their first meeting, he had been difficult for her to grasp. He said little about himself, often answered direct questions only vaguely, and yet he always seemed to know more than he showed. It was not only his silence that occupied her, but also the way he observed. Kael seemed to see and assess everything without sharing his thoughts. Eve remembered the moment when he had shown her the maps he kept in the refuge. Every line, every marking had been drawn carefully, furnished with notes that revealed long and painstaking planning. This man planned far ahead, and yet she wondered why someone with so much foresight had joined a group like hers. Why was he leading them now? Was it simple pragmatism or something deeper that he was hiding? Another image pressed into her thoughts, one she could not let go of. Kael in the old mill, studying the engravings with an almost tender caution. In those brief moments, when he believed no one was watching him, he seemed softer, less distant. It was a hard contrast to the controlled, cool facade he usually showed. What had shaped him? Eve could not help wondering what lay in his past. Had he had family, friends, or was he also a seeker who no longer knew any other choice than to keep moving forward? The thought would not let her go, and a quiet feeling of pity stirred inside her, which she immediately pushed away again. Kael did not need pity, and perhaps he had no room for it in his life. Yet no matter how hard she tried to order her thoughts, she kept returning to one point: trust. She could feel that Kael knew more than he said, that he was hiding something from all of them. But was it a danger or a protective measure? And why, despite all her doubts, did she feel drawn to him, as though he might give her answers to questions she did not even dare to ask yet? Eve did not notice that she had stopped until the group was several steps ahead. Kael turned briefly, his gaze finding hers, and she could read nothing in his dark eyes. He raised an eyebrow, as though asking whether everything was all right. She nodded curtly and began moving again, yet her thoughts continued circling around him. The shadows of the trees settled more deeply around her. And in that moment, Eve felt not only like a seeker of answers in the fog, but also like someone who wanted to understand why this particular man was leading her so relentlessly deeper into the darkness. Eve could not order her thoughts. Something about Kael drew her closer, while everything in his bearing kept her at a distance. His movements were controlled, as though he calculated every step in advance, and still there was a trace of vulnerability in him that she could not ignore. Eve was frustrated because she had no answers. She hated being left in uncertainty, and Kael was the one question that evaded every answer. His reserve and the way he always said just enough to fend off questions made her angry, but it was more than that. She sensed that he was not like this without reason. Something in his past had made him the man he was now, and though she knew she had no time for pity, she could not help feeling it. And then there was that inexplicable fascination. She did not know whether it was his eyes, which seemed to see so much and reveal nothing, or his calm voice, which always sounded as though he knew more than he said. His face was striking, with sharp cheekbones and a dark line of beard that made his presence even more mysterious. His dark hair fell restlessly into his face and moved with each step in the wind, yet even the disorder in him seemed to follow some hidden order. There was that unspoken pull that made her want to understand him. And perhaps, she thought bitterly, that was exactly the greatest mistake she could make. Wanting to understand someone who clearly did not want to be understood. Eve clenched her teeth and forced herself to look ahead, away from him. Her steps crunched on the stony path, and she felt the cold wind moving through the trees, but it brought no clarity. Kael was a knot of secrets, and she wondered whether it was even possible to untangle him, or whether doing so would only draw her deeper into his chaos. She remembered the moment when he had turned to her in the forest, his gaze as unreadable as ever. He had the ability to look into her without showing her even a trace of himself. And that made her angry. Angry at him, at herself, and at the situation they were all trapped in. Why did she feel anything for him at all? Why could she not simply see him for what he was, an ally, a companion on this dangerous journey? But deep inside, she knew it was not that simple. Kael was more than a companion. He was a riddle she wanted to solve, and at the same time, the one person she could not solve. She hated this uncertainty, this inability to see clearly. But she also knew she could not ignore him. Not as long as he was part of the group, not as long as he remained near her. The moon stood above the treetops, its light dancing through the branches. And for a moment, Eve felt like part of that darkness herself, trapped between the desire for clarity and the fear of what she might find. She forced herself to lift her head and look forward, toward the path that lay before them. Yet the questions about Kael would not let her go, and she knew it would be a long time before she could bring them to rest. The group had marched through the dense forest for hours before Garrick finally suggested taking a rest. "We all need a break," he said curtly as he set down his heavy pack and stretched. Kael nodded in agreement, and the others gradually settled down as well, grateful for the chance to rest for a short while. Clara and Finn sat a little apart from the group. The forest around them was still, except for the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. The small fire between them offered some light, yet the shadows of the trees still stood unsettlingly close. Finn drew his knees to his chest and stared into the flames, while Clara turned a flat stone over in her hand and absent-mindedly traced the grooves across it. She is different, is she not? Finn broke the silence, his voice low as though he did not want the others to listen. Clara looked up, her eyes remaining on his face for a moment before she nodded. "Mira, yes, she is different." She set the stone aside and folded her arms. "But different may be exactly what we need." Finn frowned and shook his head. "I just do not understand how she can stay so calm after everything that happened." His voice broke slightly, and Clara could feel the tension in him. "Perhaps." Clara stopped and searched for the right words. "Perhaps she has no other choice. Sometimes you have to stay calm because everything else would be worse." Her voice sounded rough, and she turned her gaze away, as if she was not sure whether she had really wanted to say that. Finn looked at her, his eyes searching for something, for an answer she could not give him. "Do you think she is afraid?" he finally asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Clara shrugged. "Of course she is afraid. Every one of us is afraid. But Mira is strong, in a way I do not understand. Perhaps because she is so young. Children see the world differently." Finn fell silent, but his eyes remained on Mira, who sat near the fire and seemed to play with a small piece of wood. Her movements were calm, almost mechanical, and yet she seemed entirely present within herself. Clara watched him and noticed the deep concern forming in his features. "You know, Finn," she began softly, "she reminds me of you sometimes." He blinked in surprise and looked away. "Me? Why?" "You were like that too," Clara answered and leaned back slightly, quiet, thoughtful. "But there was always something in you that stayed firm, something that kept you going no matter how hard things became." Finn laughed quietly, but it sounded hollow. "Maybe, but I was never like her. She is. I do not know. She knows more than she shows. Sometimes it feels as though she sees all of us." Clara tilted her head and looked at Mira again. "Maybe she does. Maybe she sees things we cannot see. Or maybe she is simply a child trying to survive, just like all of us." Another silence settled over them, but it was less heavy than before. Finn wrapped his arms more tightly around his knees and drew a deep breath. "Do you think we can protect her?" Clara closed her eyes for a moment before answering quietly. "I do not know, but we will try. We owe her that." Finn nodded slowly. The fire before them flickered, and for a moment their quiet words seemed a little less lost. The night was dark, and yet for a moment a faint trace of hope had settled between them. Clara looked into the flames, her face lit by warm, flickering light. "Do you remember, Finn, when we found that old storehouse, right after the fog had begun swallowing the city?" Finn looked up in surprise, the hint of a smile on his lips. "The storehouse? Yes, I remember. The one with the holes in the roof and the broken stairs?" Clara nodded, and a soft laugh escaped her. "That one. We had nothing except a few packs full of things we could not even use. I still remember you trying to climb that ridiculous shelf to reach the crate at the top." Finn groaned theatrically and shook his head. "It was not ridiculous. I was hungry, and you said there might be supplies up there. Besides, you were the one cheering me on to keep climbing, because I thought you could do it. Who could have known the shelf would collapse at exactly that moment?" Clara shook her head and smiled. "I still remember you landing on the floor with a loud crash, and the crate was empty. Only dust and a few old mousetraps." Finn laughed now too, his laughter a little rough but honest. "And still you held me up and said that at least we had tried. Back then I thought you were insane, but somehow it helped." Clara looked at him and shrugged. "Sometimes madness is all that keeps you going. We had nothing, Finn. No idea what was lurking out there, barely any hope. But we kept going." Finn's face grew more serious, and he lowered his gaze. "Yes, and now it is Mira. She reminds me of us back then. She is alone, but she does not give up." Clara placed a hand on his shoulder and squeezed it lightly. "We made it. And she has us. We will not abandon her." For a moment, there was silence between them again, but it was not oppressive. It was filled with memories and the unspoken realization that they had proven more than once that they could survive together. The fire crackled, and the shadows continued to dance around them while they wrapped themselves in the warmth of the flames and their shared history. The flames of the fire kept dancing, and Clara broke the silence that had settled after her last memory. "You know, Finn," she began slowly, "have you ever really thought about the others?" Finn looked at her questioningly. "The others? What do you mean?" Clara leaned back and folded her arms. "Well, Eve, Kael, Garrick. We are all so different. And yet here we are, sitting together as if that were completely normal." Finn glanced toward the group resting a little farther away in the firelight. Eve sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the flames, while Kael had almost vanished into the darkness, his face lit only briefly whenever he moved. Garrick had leaned against a tree and seemed to be resting, his silhouette heavy and motionless. "I think we all carry something with us," Finn said thoughtfully. "Eve, for example, is strong. But sometimes I wonder how long she can carry that burden alone. She always tries to stay in control, as if it were her duty to lead all of us." Clara nodded in agreement. "Yes, that is true. But perhaps she has no other choice either. I mean, someone has to do it. And she is good at making decisions. But I see it in her eyes, that fear that she may not be able to protect us after all." Finn frowned. "And Kael? What do you think of him?" Clara raised an eyebrow and briefly pressed her lips together. "Kael is difficult. He reveals nothing about himself, and still you get the feeling that he knows everything about us. He knows the rules of a game we do not even know we are playing. But there is something about him that inspires trust, even if I cannot say exactly why." "Or it is exactly the opposite," Finn murmured. "Maybe we trust him only because we have nothing else." Clara gave him a thoughtful look. "Possible. But still, he has helped us, and that is more than can be said of many others." Finn nodded slowly. His gaze moved to Garrick. "And Garrick? What do you think of him?" Clara laughed softly. "Garrick reminds me of my father. Tough, quiet, but with a heart larger than he would ever admit. He has that rough manner, but I believe he would do anything to protect us." Finn followed her gaze to the old man, who remained still as though merging with the shadows of the forest. "Yes, I believe that too." Garrick has something reliable about him. He stays standing, even when everything else falls apart. Clara fell silent for a moment and looked at the group. We are all so different, Finn. But perhaps that is exactly what we need. Perhaps this difference between us is our only chance to get through this. Finn nodded, though his eyes revealed that his doubts were not so easily driven away. The night watched silently over the group, and the flames cast their moving shadows across the faces of those who still had to remain awake. The night was quiet, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Mira sat close beside Garrick, her small hands wrapped around her knees. Her eyes looked large in the darkness, almost glowing, while she watched the dancing flames of the fire. Eve had noticed her, but did not want to press. When Garrick rose to take a few steps into the forest, Mira let her gaze follow him for a moment before moving closer to the fire, as though she had something to say. Clara, who was sitting beside Finn, watched the small figure closely. Something in Mira's posture made her pause, a mixture of tension and almost adult determination. Mira, is everything all right? Clara finally asked, keeping her voice low so as not to disturb the others. Mira flinched, as though she had not expected to be addressed, but then she nodded slowly. Her fingers played nervously with a small piece of wood she had found on the ground. Yes. I think so, she murmured. Clara threw Finn a quick glance before bending closer to Mira. If you want to talk, we are here, she said gently. You can tell us what you want to tell us. Mira looked up, her large eyes seeming even larger in the flickering firelight. She opened her mouth as though she wanted to say something, then closed it again. A moment passed before she decided to speak. I dreamed, she began softly. It was a strange dream, but I do not think it was only a dream. Clara frowned. What do you mean? Mira hesitated, but then the words seemed to flow out of her, as if she'd been holding them back all along. I was in a room. It was dark, but there were lights. Stars maybe, but they moved. And I could hear them. They spoke. Not with words, but I knew what they wanted to say. Finn frowned while Clara listened attentively. What did they say, Mira? She asked carefully. Mira closed her eyes as though trying to remember. They said the fog is coming, that it has always been there, but now it wants more. And then they said that I... She stopped, her voice faltering as if she was unsure whether she should continue. Clara placed a hand on her shoulder. What did they say, Mira? She asked again, even more gently. Mira looked at her, and in her eyes lay a mixture of fear and determination. That I am the connection. That they see through me. That they want to find me. Clara felt her stomach tighten. Who are they? Mira shook her head. I do not know, but I think they are like the fog, or they come from it, and they are looking for me because I can feel them. Finn looked at Clara, and in his gaze was the same concern she felt. Mira, have you had dreams like that before? He asked carefully. Mira nodded slowly. Yes, but this time it was different. It was stronger, as if they were closer. Clara drew Mira closer and placed an arm around her shoulders. We are here, and we will protect you, she said quietly. She deliberately avoided dismissing the dream as only a dream, because her own words would have sounded hollow otherwise. Mira leaned against Clara, but her gaze remained watchful, almost grown up, as she stared into the darkness beyond the fire. Somewhere inside, she knew that even Clara's comfort was only half made of certainty, because it had not been a dream, not really, and whatever was approaching would not simply disappear. The darkness seemed to embrace Mira while she stayed at Clara's side, yet her thoughts carried her far away from the warmth of the fire and the protective shadows of the group. She could almost feel the stars from her dream, a faint pulsing in the distance that vibrated through her body. It was not only a dream, she finally whispered without looking at Clara. Her voice was barely more than a breath, yet the silence of the forest carried her words to the others. Finn straightened slightly, his gaze resting attentively on Mira. "What was it then?" Clara asked carefully. She did not want to press Mira, but the intensity in her voice could not be hidden. Mira closed her eyes and let her head sink against Clara's shoulder. It was a place, but not really. I could feel it, but not see it. There was this light that showed me the way. It brought me to something that looked like a mirror, but it was not a mirror. It showed things I do not understand. Finn leaned closer, his brow furrowed. "What kind of things?" Mira hesitated, her fingers nervously playing with the edge of Clara's cloak. "People," she whispered. "I saw people I do not know, but they were important." And then there was darkness. Not simply night, but something greater. Something that lives and devours everything. Clara exchanged a quick glance with Finn before asking softly, "Did you see anything else, Mira? Anything that could help us?" Mira opened her eyes, and there was a clarity in her gaze that made Clara shiver. There was a word. It shone like the stars. I do not know what it means, but I cannot forget it. Finn leaned forward. "What word?" Mira drew a deep breath before answering. "Nexus." The word hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. Clara felt her pulse quicken, and even Finn, who usually seemed so calm, looked shaken. "The Nexus," Clara murmured, remembering the mentions in Garrick's notes and the stories they had heard on the road. "That is no coincidence. Everything leads there." Eve suddenly raised her head, the words striking her with full force. "Mira, are you sure that was the word?" Her voice was tense, almost breathless. The word tore open everything she had tried to put in order since the encounter with the figure of light. "I have heard of it, but not in a good context." Mira looked from one to the other as though she wanted to make sure they understood. "It called me. I do not know why, but it wanted me to see it. And it wanted me to tell you." Clara pressed a hand to her forehead while trying to order the information. "We have to talk to Garrick. He may know more about the Nexus. Perhaps he can interpret this." Mira looked into the darkness again, her eyes alert. "It will not wait," she said at last. "It is already on its way." Finn placed a hand on her small shoulder. "We are on our way too, Mira, and we will not let it reach you." The group remained silent for a moment, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Yet in the cool night air there was a promise, an unspoken bond tying them all together. And even though the darkness was drawing closer, it felt at least in that moment as though they could face it together. Eve could hardly ignore the weight of Mira's words. Nexus. The word echoed in her head as though it had touched a hidden page within her. Memories forced themselves upon her of the moment when she had touched the sphere on the altar, when the figure of light had appeared before her. Back then, she had spoken of the Nexus, of the choice Eve had to make and the consequences that would follow. She had renewed the barrier, yet the figure's words would not leave her. The energy of the Nexus is not destroyed, it is bound, yet it will always seek a way. That word, that place, was not only a memory, but a warning. The Nexus was more than an abstract concept from Garrick's notes or a vision. It was real. It was the core of everything. Her gaze moved to Mira, who leaned close against Clara, still vulnerable and yet so important. Eve felt a wave of compassion for the girl, but also a trace of uncertainty. Why was Mira the one having these visions? And what was that supposed to mean for their group? Eve shook her head slightly and forced herself to push the thoughts aside. There were more important things to consider right now. Unbidden, her eyes drifted to Kael, who stood a little apart, his arms crossed over his chest. His face was calm, almost expressionless, yet his eyes revealed that he was thinking. Deeply. The shadow of the flames reflected in his gaze, as though he was searching for an answer inside himself. It was rare to see him look so openly thoughtful, and Eve could not help wondering what was passing through his mind. "Kael," she finally began, her voice quiet but carrying a sharpness she could not entirely suppress. "You know this word, do you not? Nexus. It means something to you." Kael slowly lifted his gaze to her. For a moment he seemed to weigh her question before answering. "Perhaps," he said at last, his voice calm and yet difficult to read. "But what it means is something we still have to discover." Eve clenched her teeth. Again he evaded her, leaving only fragments of answers behind. But this time it was different. His gaze was more intense, and his reserve did not seem to come from arrogance, but from protection. Protection from what? From them? From himself? She saw his eyes briefly move to Mira, then to Clara and Finn, who were also listening attentively. Kael seemed to weigh everything, every word, every reaction. "We should prepare," he said finally, breaking the tension. "If the Nexus is important, we will learn more soon. But not now." Eve felt the urge to ask further, to press him, but she stopped herself. Perhaps it was better to let him watch, to wait until he was ready. Yet one thing was clear. Kael knew more than he admitted, and that made him both fascinating and difficult to grasp. A part of her wanted to understand him, not only because of their mission, but because he drew her in a way she could not explain. The crackling of the fire was the only sound breaking the silence. Eve let her gaze move back to the group, her thoughts still on Kael and on whatever bound them all together. The Nexus was more than a word. It was the key to what she still had to discover. The fire had burned down to a gentle glow. The silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of the forest, but the atmosphere within the group felt heavy and oppressive. Each of them seemed trapped in their own thoughts, the exhaustion and strain of the journey weighing on them. Eve looked at Kael, who sat apart from the others, his hood drawn low over his face. She could see the tension in his shoulders, and her own impatience began to overwhelm her. Ever since she had noticed his reaction to the Nexus, she had been convinced that Kael knew more than he revealed. But it was not only that reaction that troubled her. It was the many times he had slipped away from her curiosity with evasive answers and vague hints. Every unanswered question, every mysterious silence had ignited a growing frustration inside her that was now close to boiling over. "Kael," she began. Her voice was hard and clear, and for a moment everything around the fire fell silent. "I have had enough of your evasions. If you know something, then tell us. We all have a right to know the truth." The others looked up, their attention suddenly awakened. Finn looked from Eve to Kael and back again, while Clara pulled Mira closer to herself as though to shield the girl from a possible escalation. Kael slowly raised his head, his gaze meeting Eve's, cool and measured. "What exactly do you want to know?" he asked, in a voice that carried more frustration than willingness. "Everything," Eve said with emphasis. "What you know about the Nexus, why you are even here, why we should trust you if you tell us nothing about yourself." "Eve," Garrick began with a warning undertone, but she raised a hand to silence him. Her eyes remained fixed on Kael. Kael took his time answering, which only increased the tension. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but with a coldness that settled between them. "You want the truth? The truth is that you know me as little as I know you. But I am here because I have to be. Because I believe it cannot be done without me. Is that enough for you?" "No, that is not enough for me," Eve said, her voice sharper than intended. "We are risking our lives. We follow you even though we do not know where. The least you could do is be honest with us." Kael's eyes narrowed, and for a moment it looked as though he would answer, but he stopped himself. Instead, he turned his gaze away and stared into the darkness. "The truth is often more dangerous than you believe," he finally murmured. Finn cleared his throat softly, clearly trying to ease the situation. He felt the growing weight of the tension between Eve and Kael and knew how dangerous this dynamic could become. From experience, he had learned how easily such conflicts could divide a group. Words could prevent an escalation, and he had often found himself in the role of mediator. He had no wish to let a dispute boil over, not after everything he had seen. Perhaps we should discuss this later, when we can all think more clearly. It has been a long day. Later. Eve turned toward Finn, her eyes flashing with frustration. How often are we going to say later? At some point we have to act. Eve. Garrick now intervened, his voice calm but firm. I understand your impatience, but we all have secrets, and sometimes there is a reason why people keep them. A heavy silence settled over the group. Eve clenched her hands into fists, but she knew she would get no further, not tonight. She stood and turned away from the fire to stare into the darkness. Her thoughts raced, trapped between frustration and the unsettling realization that she truly did not know Kael. Kael remained in his place, his gaze following her briefly before drifting back into the shadows of the forest. The darkness felt calming, almost protective, while his thoughts remained restless. He knew Eve's persistence was justified, and yet unease grew inside him. She saw more than he liked, pressing into places he himself had not entered for a long time. His gaze moved across the shadows, as if searching there for answers that had long since slipped from him. Her determination fascinated him, but it also made him doubt. It was a strength that could easily become her downfall, and his. He was fighting things he had believed were long behind him. Clara finally broke the silence. Perhaps we should all get a little rest. We need clear heads if we want to understand what lies ahead. The group remained in thoughtful silence, the fire now little more than a faint breath of embers. And although they were physically together, each of them seemed strangely alone in that moment. Eve pressed her lips together while staring into the darkness. Her frustration was still boiling inside her, but now a hint of shame mixed with it. Had she gone too far? She felt she was right, that Kael's secrecy endangered the group, but the memory of how the others had looked at her, Clara's cautious glance, Finn's soothing tone, Garrick's calm warning, made her doubt herself. Everyone in the group had placed their lives in the hands of the others, and Eve felt the weight of that responsibility more heavily than ever. Kael's silence felt like betrayal, even though she knew she could not force answers from him. She had to say it, she thought, almost as if trying to convince herself. It was about more than her. It was about everything that was at stake. Yet despite that conviction, she felt heat rise in her cheeks as she thought of Kael's evasive gaze. It was not only frustration that had driven her. Something about him threw her off balance, something she could not explain. The night was quiet, broken only now and then by the rustling of the trees and the soft sounds of the group. The conversations Eve's confrontation had triggered began to continue in quieter but no less meaningful words. Clara sat beside Finn, the two of them having moved a little away from the group. Mira's soft breathing beneath Clara's cloak made the night seem a little more peaceful, but Clara's gaze remained watchful. She lowered her voice so only Finn could hear. Kael is a riddle, is he not? Finn nodded thoughtfully. He's not exactly open, but I think he truly believes he is doing the right thing. He seems as though he is constantly fighting something invisible. Clara frowned. Against what, do you think? Himself? Or something else? Finn leaned back and looked into the darkness. Maybe both. There are people who keep secrets because they think they are protecting others, but sometimes they are also hiding from themselves. Clara gave him a covert sideways glance, her thoughts racing. Yet Finn's face remained unreadable, and Clara found no way into what lay behind his calm. Was it ignorance, or did he actually know more than he said? Did he mean it only in general? Or did he know more about what had happened in the healing house than she had assumed? For a brief moment she wondered whether he was testing her, but his expression remained calm. Clara let his words sink in for a moment. She remembered Kael's reaction to the mention of the Nexus, the way his cool facade had faltered for an instant. "I do not fully trust him," she finally said, "but I do not think he is our enemy. Not directly." "I see it the same way," Finn agreed. "The question is only how far we can follow him without knowing where he is leading us." Not far from them sat Garrick, half listening to their conversation while unrolling a map. His fingers moved over the lines, over familiar paths and unknown roads, but his face showed the quiet frustration of a man forced to make too many uncertain decisions. Finally, he spoke without raising his eyes. "We do not have time for mistrust. Whether we trust him or not does not matter as long as we stay together. The fog will not wait for us while we settle our differences." Clara looked at Garrick, her eyes narrowed, but she knew he was right. "That does not mean we should be blind. Caution has brought us this far." Garrick raised his head and fixed her with a penetrating gaze, his tone carrying the weight of many years. "Caution, yes. But caution must not turn into paralysis. Sometimes one has to act even when the answers are unclear." Finn sighed and rubbed his hands together. "Perhaps we have no choice but to trust that the truth will come to light eventually." Clara looked back to Kael, who sat silently apart, his face hidden in the half-darkness. "I hope it does," she murmured, her voice barely more than a whisper. The cracks in the group were small, but they were there, inconspicuous and dangerous, ready to open under further pressure. Clara knew that fragility was their greatest danger. The coolness of the night had settled over the world, and Kael felt the darkness around him as if it were a familiar presence. The group had scattered, each with their own thoughts, but Kael felt more isolated than ever. Without a word, he rose from his place and moved away soundlessly, his steps light on the damp ground. The forest around him took him in, but there was no comfort in it. The shadows of the trees stood silently around him, watching and judging. The fog had not only swallowed his world, it lived inside him, a shadow that never receded. Kael pulled his hood deeper over his face and finally stopped in a small clearing where moonlight fell through the branches. His gaze drifted into the distance, but the images in his head were near and unavoidable. He remembered voices from his childhood, screams, the sudden silence when the fog came. It had always been the fog that had erased everything he had once known and loved, his hands clenched into fists while he fought the flood of memories. Kael thought of the group. Each of them moved within a game whose rules no one understood. Eve, with her determination and her piercing eyes, so often brought him to the edge of discomfort. She broke through the walls he had built so carefully around himself, and that made her more dangerous than any creature of the fog. Clara, with her protective instinct for Mira, and Finn, the peacemaker, whose gaze often revealed more than he said. Garrick, the pragmatist, who seemed to analyze everything beneath the surface. Yet it was Eve who occupied him most. She asked the questions no one else dared to ask, and her persistence was both impressive and dangerous. Kael knew she wanted to see through him, that she was searching for answers he could not give. Not now. Perhaps never. He sighed and lifted his gaze to the moon, whose light remained a distant glimmer of hope. The prophecy, the shadows, the Nexus, everything was interwoven, a net that held them all captive. He had once allowed others to suffer because of his decisions. This time, he would not let it go that far. Kael knew he was part of this net, but what purpose he was meant to fulfill within it remained a mystery even to him. A soft sound made him listen. His head snapped to the side, his hand instinctively sliding to his weapon. His heart beat faster, his muscles tightening, ready to face any danger. He knew the fog never allowed him to forget its presence. But it was nothing threatening, only the wind moving a branch. Still, Kael remained tense, because true danger was rarely obvious. Finally, he turned and went back to the group. His steps were calm, but inside him a storm was raging. When he returned to his place, he felt the eyes of the others on him, especially Eve's. Her gaze was a blade cutting deeper with every moment. Yet Kael knew he must not yield, not to her. He held his ground, keeping his own gaze cool and unreadable. The night settled over the group again, but Kael knew the day that followed would bring more questions than he was ready to answer. The night was already far advanced, and the darkness seemed impenetrable. The group sat scattered around the fading embers of the fire, each member deep in thought. But the deceptive calm was suddenly broken by a strange sound, a deep, rumbling hum that came from the distance. Eve was the first to react. Her hand instinctively moved to her dagger as she straightened and stared into the darkness. "Did you hear that?" Her voice was calm but tense. Garrick stood too, his brow furrowed. "That does not sound like wind." He reached for the heavy metal rod he always carried and peered toward the direction from which the sound came. Kael, who had been sitting silently at the edge of the group, straightened and drew back his hood. His gaze was sharp, his eyes searching the forest. "It is coming closer," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. Clara pulled Mira closer, while Finn took his axe in hand and stepped protectively in front of them. "Whatever it is," he said with quiet determination, "we face it together." The group formed up instinctively, each of them taking a position that offered both protection and defense. The humming grew louder, a vibrating sound that made the ground beneath their feet tremble. Then, from the shadows of the forest, a hazy figure appeared. The creature was tall, nearly twice the height of a human, and its outlines shimmered in the fog. Its movements seemed jerky, yet there was a terrifying precision in them. Two pairs of glowing eyes fixed on the group, and a deep growl escaped its throat. Eve felt her heart beat faster, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Stay together," she called, her voice firm. "Do not let it split us apart." Kael stepped forward and drew a sword from beneath his coat. The blade shimmered dully in the faint light, as though it had rested for a long time. Eve threw him a startled look. Where exactly had he been keeping that sword? But she had no time to ask the question. "Distract it," he said curtly without turning around. "If we throw it off balance, we can strike." Garrick nodded curtly and moved in the opposite direction. With a precise throw, he hurled a heavy stone at the creature. The impact made it pause for a moment, and its deep growl grew louder, almost angry. Finn used the distraction, rushed forward and struck with his axe. The blow was precise, but the creature barely reacted. Its glowing eyes flickered for an instant, and a deep hissing sound escaped its throat, as though the blow had touched something inside it. Then its claws slashed through the air, and Finn had to retreat in a flash to avoid being hit. The creature pressed after him, and the ground beneath its claws tore open as though the fog itself had gained weight. For a moment, the group's formation threatened to break. Clara pulled Mira back. Garrick moved sideways in front of Finn, and Eve stepped into the gap that had opened between them. The creature's next strike hit a rotten tree stump and tore it into dark splinters that scattered across the ground. Mira, who had remained silent until then, suddenly cried out. Her eyes were wide open, and she pointed at the creature. "There, the chest. There is a light there like the runes." Her voice trembled, but there was a strange certainty in her words, as though she recognized the truth in the patterns of light. Eve followed her gaze and saw it. A faint, pulsing light shimmered in the creature's chest, barely visible through the fog surrounding it. "That is its weak point," she called. "Aim for it." The group continued their attacks, now with a clear target. Clara, who had been protecting Mira, let go of her briefly to pick up a stone and throw it with all her strength. The hit was precise, and the light flickered briefly before stabilizing again. Finn was still reeling from the nearly fatal strike, but he raised his axe once more and forced the creature back with a sideways blow. Garrick drove his metal rod against one of its long legs, not strongly enough to break it, but enough to disturb its next step. Kael seized the opportunity. With a swift leap, he drove his sword straight into the creature's chest. A bone-shaking scream rang out, and the light in its chest flickered again before going out. The creature collapsed in on itself, its outlines dissolving into the fog until nothing remained. The group stood still, and the silence after the fight was almost deafening. Every one of them was breathing hard, and a fleeting moment of understanding passed through their ranks. Their gazes moved between the remains of the creature and one another, each of them searching for answers. No one had. Garrick was the first to speak. That was no ordinary creature. That was something else. Eve nodded, her thoughts racing. Something from the fog. But why now? And why here? Mira looked at her with wide eyes. Maybe they wanted to test us, or warn us. No one had an answer. Yet one thing was clear. The fog was no longer only a distant threat. It was here, and it would not disappear until they discovered how to face it. The group sat together again after the fight, exhaustion clear on every face. The fire they had rekindled flickered and cast shadows across the tense features of those gathered around it. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional crackle of the flames. Eve finally broke it. That was close. If Mira had not seen the light, we might not have made it. Her gaze moved to the girl sitting beside Clara. Mira looked tired, but there was something in her eyes that could almost have been pride. How did you recognize it? Mira hesitated, her hands playing with a loose thread on her cloak. Her fingers drew small patterns in the soil, unconsciously similar to the runes she had seen before. I do not know exactly. It was simply there. A feeling. The runes we saw feel similar. A feeling? Garrick frowned. His voice sounded skeptical, but not dismissive. Perhaps you have a connection to these things that we do not understand. That is something we can use. Clara placed a protective hand on Mira's shoulder and gently drew her closer. Whatever it was, it helped us. But we cannot risk you overextending yourself. Her gaze grew serious, and she looked at the others. We need a plan. Right, Finn agreed, his axe lying beside him on the ground. We have to be better prepared. That was only one creature. What if there are more? Or stronger ones? Kael sat apart from them, his gaze fixed on the sword in his hands. Firelight reflected on the blade as he spoke softly. There will be more, and they will be stronger. His voice was calm, almost cold, yet the words made the air heavier. What do we do then? Eve asked, turning her gaze to Garrick. The older man nodded slowly, his face deeply lined with thought. We have to know what we are dealing with. More knowledge means more chances to survive. Perhaps we should begin to act systematically. Who observes? Who defends? Who leads? He looked at Kael. You seem to know more. Perhaps you can tell us what we should watch for. Kael lifted his gaze, his eyes meeting Garrick's, but he said nothing. Instead, he slipped the sword back under his coat and stood. For a moment he seemed as though he wanted to speak, but the words remained unsaid. If I find something that helps us, I will say it. But my advice is this. Expect anything. His words left a tense silence, which Eve finally broke. We should also consider how we can make better use of our strengths. Mira has something special, and I think she could guide us when it comes to these things. Clara and Finn, you work well together, and we should use that. Kael. She hesitated, her eyes searching for his gaze, but he had already turned away again. We need you, whether you want that or not. Clara nodded in agreement. "And you, Eve, you are leading us already, whether you call it that or not." Eve shook her head, but said nothing. Instead, she looked into the flames, her thoughts a chaotic tangle. A leader? She had never intended to be one. She would have expected that role to fall to Garrick, a man with experience and pragmatism. Yet the group clearly had different expectations of her. She felt overwhelmed, as though the weight of responsibility were pressing down on her shoulders. Why her? Why now? The thought that she might be the only one who could lead this group out of the nightmare was both frightening and binding. And still, a doubt gnawed at her. Was she truly strong enough to carry that burden? The night remained still, but the tensions were tangible. Every one of them knew the fight they had just survived had only been a foretaste. The real challenges still lay ahead, and no one could say whether they were ready for them. Finally, the group decided that they had to rest. They agreed to take turns keeping watch while the others slept. The watch was necessary, but no one felt safe, even in the moments when their eyes closed. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound felt like a herald of what was still to come. One after another they closed their eyes, but the thoughts of the creature, and of whatever might still come, made sleep heavy and restless.